House advisor Josh Groenbaum and Jared Kushner. Let's bring in, and you can see him on screen there, Pyotr Kurzin. He's the host of the widely acclaimed political podcast, The Global Gambit, that's on YouTube and Substack. Pyotr is also a former UN and World Bank official and John Hopkins SAIS alumni. I hope I've got that all right, Pyotr. Thanks so much for joining us. We've seen everything that's happened diplomatically, but let's just focus on the ground quickly. We've seen all these power outages going on. It's now the stakes being raised because we have also seen it stretch as far as Moldova.
Yeah, I think it's, firstly, thank you for having me, but secondly, an illustration of just how bad things get. Each winter we've seen it getting worse, but this is the worst winter, and very much the Kremlin is undeterred in its willingness to indiscriminately strike across the country, but of course with a greater intensification in Kiev, despite Trump's efforts to try to get Russia to, or the Kremlin to, have this pause, whatever that means these days. The Ukrainian people are very much at the receiving end of the Kremlin's hard power. And diplomatic efforts are very limited, but I'm sure we'll come to that in a minute.
Well, yeah, you talk about that, and you use a crucial word, they're undeterred. And if we're thinking about the Kremlin being undeterred, what has given Steve Witkoff any understanding that these have been constructive talks with the Kremlin? I mean, there's no reason for them to budge on their territorial demands.
No, there isn't, and I think it's largely because Witkoff is trying to play save face, if that's the expression, right? He's trying to demonstrate perhaps more optimism than there actually is, and I don't like to say that. I'd obviously like to talk to you in a more positive capacity, but Witkoff has his questionable relations with the Kremlin. We've seen the images of him being pretty cushy and friendly with Putin, and Putin gives him a very deliberate hug. At the end of the day, diplomacy is as much about optics as it is about what actually is pushed through in policy. And when Putin hugs, I don't know, Miranda Modi, or when he hugs Witkoff, it's a demonstration that they are quite close. And so I think Witkoff is trying to give hope to perhaps the Ukrainians, or more so strategic patience to the Europeans and Trump himself, that progress is being made, because we know how much Trump flip-flops over these things. If you cast your minds back a month, the situation for Putin was not as ideal, and he's since seen some relative improvements, with Trump wanting him to be part of the board of peace, and obviously the continued legitimization of the regime as a trading partner. So I think that unfortunately we're back at square one, where these are largely bilateral meetings. And the last point I'd make is simply that this is because the Kremlin does not see, or Putin does not see, Ukraine as a legitimate partner in this, or player. They are an insubordinate, a proxy, and that's why Putin always phrases his statements to the Kremlin, to the White House, and occasionally Europe.
Let's take that, and if you don't mind me saying, cynical scenario of the Kremlin just bypassing Ukraine. Surely the United States also has a red line. No matter how cozy we do see Trump and Witkoff appearing to play it with Kirill, Dmitriev, and the likes. Surely they do also have a limit.
They do. Of course they do. And we can see that with what's happening with the Shadow Fleet. If there's one takeaway I would emphasize to viewers and listeners, it is that this is about leverage and bargaining power. And right now, while the Kremlin may have seen relative improvements to a couple of weeks ago, it's still very testing times. I would point to what's happening in Iran right now. The willingness of the United States to use hard power and coercion to capitulate other entities into agreeing. And this goes for Russia. Right now, we are seeing the Europeans, and to an extent the United States military, clamp down on the biggest asset that the Russians have been leveraging in the past few months, which is the Shadow Fleet. So Putin is definitely not out of the woods. He has to play things carefully. But as we know, the fatigue of this war is very clear on both sides, but especially for the Ukrainians. Any recent pollings would demonstrate that more Ukrainians than ever are open to the idea of a ceasefire. And again, it's not the position I'd like to be on, but I prefer pragmatist than cynicist, but I understand your point. And lastly, I would just also say that it comes down to, I think, what the Europeans can do in filling the gap that the Americans might be trying to reduce in terms of their support for the Ukrainians.
And the Europeans have stressed that there is a potential to use the crisis fund that's up to about 514 billion euros of the European Stability Mechanism. But that's more for countries around Ukraine, not Ukraine specifically. But you mentioned an interesting point there, Pyotr, just about Iran. I don't suppose that you could give us some indication as to what Putin might think. Were the US to actually strike Iran, would that change his view? Would his optics change at all in terms of Ukraine?
You know, this is something I've been thinking about for a while because unlike Syria about a year and a bit ago, Russia really is at a bad position if it loses Iran. It lost Syria, it lost the Shir Crescent, which is where sort of from the Levant and Lebanon all the way down into Iran, you had a lot of proxies and entities that Russia could leverage. Now, they've just hosted al-Sharar, if I'm saying his name correctly, in the Kremlin in Moscow. And that's important because Russia needs the military bases in Syria. However, if it loses Iran, which is much more of a strategic partner and also in a sense an ideological one, because it's a counterbalancing against the anti-US order, et cetera, that's huge. But again, I sort of come to the materialistic and pragmatic side, which is that Russia doesn't have the bandwidth. They are absolutely bogged down in Ukraine. Whether or not they're relatively doing better than Ukraine given the winter, it still doesn't mean that they can exert power across the Middle East in the same way. And what are you really going to see? The Americans being intercepted by Russian MiGs? I don't think so. So I think it's largely going to be strong condemnation and frustration. But I don't see what Putin can do physically to stop this. Although I'm skeptical of how far the Americans are going to go in Iran.
Would that event actually? sorry, Pyotr. Would that event actually change the way that America mediates with these talks, or would that be a completely separate issue? And would Russia be able to see it that way? Would they listen at all?
Well, I would point you to I think it was in the Washington Post that reported it, but there was indication that the Russians had actually been a mediator between the Islamic Republic regime and the Israeli government, with both exercising that they would not, or communicating, telegraphing, that they would not make preemptive strikes, which is basically saying, the Israelis saying, this is an American operation, whatever the Americans do, we're not part of that, and the Iranians recognizing that they would only respond to the Americans, which is interesting. Obviously, we've seen subsequent statements from the foreign minister saying that they would respond to Israel. My point being is that the Russians are clearly trying to be pragmatic about this and minimize the fallout, partially for Iran itself, but of course their own interests. Also because I think that the recent revelations around China's general and the bit of a purge that we saw in Beijing is a problem for Russia as well, because their long-standing support from Beijing now also wobbles in Iran. It's not looking great from the Russian perspective, at least in a strategical sense. Tactically, it's right now they've got the upper hand probably over Ukraine.
Well, let's just quickly finish off on the tactics, because in the Russian Duma, there were lawmakers, and you see that strap just below you, urging the use of weapons of retribution. That was according to the Speaker of the Parliament's lower chamber, Vyacheslav Volodin. Do we expect Russia will go for more scorched earth policies going forward now?
That's a good question, and I would need to read some more into that specific statement. But based on my experience, when Russia's back is up against the wall, they do resort to maximalist things. If you cast your mind back again to late 2022, when the Ukrainians made that remarkable counter-offensive towards Kharkiv, that was when we saw genuinely what concerned a lot of military analysts of potential nuclear threats from the Kremlin. And then we saw what Putin called a partial mobilization, which was obviously basically full at around, 500,000, and the mass, the exoduses of millions of Russians into Georgia and alike. So I personally look what comes primarily out of the Kremlin, not out of the places like the State Duma, because ultimately they don't have influence on policy as much as the Kremlin does, and certainly not people like Dmitry Medvedev, who is just ridiculous. But anyway, so I would take note of it, but I wouldn't let it determine the overall decision making of the Kremlin.
Pyotr Kurzin, thank you so much for all your thoughts. A really fascinating outlook on the way of on the state of play as things stand. Pyotr Kurzin coming to us there from London. Let's now